Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. It's you can join by going online to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. Jim has written over 1,400 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 31. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Well, we're going to pretty much pick up where we left off last time. There's a little disjointing there, so if you notice there's something missing, there he is. Today we're going to talk about Morrill Hall, which is almost, but not quite as old as the University of Nebraska, just celebrating its 150th birthday. In fact, the University of Nebraska had just barely been completed and had not even officially moved into its first building, which was dead in the middle of the 4 square block campus, which we'll be taking a tour. It won't take very long because 4 square blocks encompasses about where Sheldon Art Gallery is today. But before they even moved into that building, the Board of Regents approved a $1,000 grant for the creation of a university museum. They called it a cabinet instead of a museum at that time. And in 1874, the first exhibits appeared for the University of Nebraska State Museum of Natural History. It's going to change its name several times through the years. And it opened on an upper floor, an old University Hall or Nebraska Hall, or as Willa Cather called it, the university, because there was only one building at that time. And it existed there off and on, open, but not regularly until 1888. When the name changed to the Nebraska State Museum, and they moved over into Nebraska Hall. Nebraska Hall was at that point in time 3 years old, built in 1885, and it was the second or third or fourth building built on the campus, depending exactly on when they opened. It was on the northeast corner of the original campus, the 4 square block, 10-acre campus, which would put it where today the chemistry building is, and we remember it as Richards Hall and other buildings. At that point in time, a man by the name of Irwin H. Barbour and his sister Carrie arrived at the University of Nebraska. He was going to teach zoology and geology. He came in 1891 and was followed by his sister in 1892, Carrie. But almost at once, they were dedicating their lives to the museum. Now, we've talked about the museum in early iterations of it, but we're going to talk today more specifically about Morrill Hall. One student remarked because they, at that time, locked the gates of the campus every night at 10 o'clock, often Barbour and his sister would become so engaged in whatever they were doing in the museum that they would be noticed climbing over the fence to get out. And Miss Barbour tended, as was the style, to wear very long dresses. It was apparently a sight to behold, but they would often have to come over the top. Why they were not given keys is a good question. Certainly they must have trusted them. But their home was at that time on R Street, approximately where Love Library is today. We have pictures of it, just a rather standard-looking small house. The collection was at that time growing very rapidly. They were storing it all over the University of Nebraska, and as soon as the steam tunnels were built, it became fair game. They were storing stuff in the steam tunnels as well. Stepping aside to Charles Morrill. He came to Stromsburg in Polk County, Nebraska, after being a private in the Civil War in the 11th New Hampshire Volunteers. Then he became Governor Nance's private secretary. From there on, he became a very successful banker, first in Stromsburg, land manager, town site developer, and a pretty politically astute player in the politics of Nebraska. And in 1890, he was elected to the Board of Trustees of the University of Nebraska, later known as the Board of Regents. And when Barbour arrived, they became close personal friends. One of the things that Barbour had discovered early on was out near Morrill's home something he called tyantotheres, which were spiral-shaped, what he thought were animals, but in fact, apparently, they ultimately turned out to be merely burrows. But nonetheless, it fascinated Morrill enough that he developed an interest in anthropology and other things that Barbour was also interested in. And Morrill started financing expeditions all over to discover new sites. But by the 1890s, he withdrew his support from these field trips because he said there was inadequate space to display them anyway. Stuff was just being stored away and never would be seen, and stored away apparently rather ineptly. So he withdrew his support. And besides the building, which I remember as an engineering building, he claimed the building was crumbling and dissolving just as the first building had done. I was unaware of it because it was on the campus when we were in the university, and it seemed to be pretty solid at that point in time. But Nebraska Hall, it was then called, began to disintegrate. And the museum then moved into the building which we talked about 2 or 3 times ago, affectionately called the Splinter, and it was designed by Thomas Rogers Kimball, who we were talking about a minute ago. And it was designed to be the first of 4 parts of a building. And it looked sort of like 3 parts, like this. This was the part that they designed and moved into. Later, Kimball had designed 2 parts, and the top, which would have connected them, would have been a 4-part building. All they ever built was what I call the Splinter, and that became the museum of the University of Nebraska. So they moved in there directly to the north of Grant Hall. If that helps you, and Grant Hall is where Sheldon was located. So pretty much at the north end of what's now Sheldon's parking lot. They moved into that building. This building was soon crowded as well, and one professor who had been loaning his specimens to the museum for display complained about Carrie Barbour's housekeeping. He said that he was afraid the building would burn down because she was a very poor housekeeper. March the 6th of 1912, the building burned down. It wasn't Carrie's fault at all, had nothing to do with her housekeeping. Looking back on it, it appears that probably there was a gas leak below the staircase to the 2nd floor, and somehow that ignited. The building was intended, Mr. Rogers had intended it to be fireproof. That's always a danger, to tell somebody that a building's going to be fireproof, because it didn't. It didn't burn to the ground. Actually, it burned out, and that building stood on the campus and was in constant use as such things as the university's police department. The geography department was in there for a while. And I got to say, one of the ugliest buildings on campus. I'm looking at architects to see if anybody agrees. I'm getting a mixed reaction, but it was not the building it was intended to be. It had been converted to classrooms, and the university police department and so forth. So not much of a building. And one of the things that prevented the building from being used again and completing the 4-part building was, one, Mr. Morrill was really irritated at Thomas Rogers Kimball for designing a building that didn't prove to be fireproof. And secondly, the building was gone enough that there wasn't any use for it. But in the 1920s, Morrill began lobbying for a new building to be built on the campus. And he even said that he would personally contribute $10,000 for this new building. The legislature then approved the architect Davis and Wilson for a building whose footprint would be on the southwest corner of 14th and University Place. We think of University Place as a location now with a university on it, but University Place was the name of a street. And today we think of U Street and V Street, which they ultimately will become, but in the initial plan, it was U Street was University Place. It only ran up to about maybe 15th, 16th, 17th Street, then it became U Street, but that's as Lincoln grew, and V Street became Vine Street. So the alphabetical part worked out ultimately, but what we think of as U Street now was then University Place. So that's where it was. And we all probably know where Morrill Hall is located. The approval was, originally they were going to cut the proposal down to $300,000, but construction would begin, as we see it here, on what would ultimately be named Morrill Hall. 65,000 square feet, and it was deemed fireproof. Completed in 1927, moved into in February of 1927. At the end of the main gallery was what I recall Elephant Hall, and I think anybody who's old enough called it Elephant Hall. In fact, the whole building became known as Elephant Hall, featuring paintings by Elizabeth Dolan, which were from a concept of a cave in France, with ancient drawings on it. The top 2 floors of the building became the temporary home of the Nebraska Art Association's collection. Temporary in that it lasted only 40 years before they built Sheldon Art Gallery. As I said, Morrill Hall was more aptly to be called, there's the building in completion, Elephant Hall. And in 1939, the name of the museum was changed again to the University of Nebraska State Museum. 1971, a new 65,000 square foot facility was opened in a new Nebraska Hall, which, if you've been around long enough, you know is the old Elgin building on campus, but now they've changed the name to Nebraska Hall. This gave us humidity-controlled storage and temperature for a lot of the overflow of exhibit materials. And they moved into that building just 84 years after they had been established. Now, approximately 150 years old, the museum also houses Mueller Planetarium, as well as displays of dinosaurs, fossils, rocks, and so forth. But to some of us, it's still Elephant Hall. They have just now opened, I believe it's the top floor, which was used for other things. Now it's become part of the museum. So if you haven't been there in the last year or so, you'll find it's greatly expanded. The Hudson Cabin. The Nebraska State Fair, of course, moved to Grand Island in about 2010, and the old fairgrounds became part of the University of Nebraska's expansion as Innovation Campus. Literally, only a couple of the buildings survive. The 1913 Arsenal, which was the Nebraska National Guard's building, has now been turned over to the University of Nebraska, and what they're doing with it, I'm not sure. It's small, and I suspicion it's used nothing but storage. The 4-H building has been converted at a tremendous expense into a beautiful building. The Devaney Sports Center is left over. And we have the Trapezoidal Agriculture Hall Exposition Building, which you can say it's been saved, but literally some of the walls have been saved, so literally nothing's left of the old one. But at that time, we had some things going on out there. The Depression Area District 113 Cunningham School had been moved to the fairgrounds as part of what they called Heritage Village. That was one of the first parts. In 1975, included the Roca Depot ultimately, but as the university acquired the property, all of these things were moved away. The Roca Depot moved out to the Lancaster Event Center, and then the school moved to Pioneers Park, where I think it's still used by 4th graders, but at least that was the intention at that point in time. Looking back now to Thomas Jefferson Hudson. He was born in 1826 in Indiana, and after several moves ever further to the west, he arrived in Otto County in 1861, so it's still territoryhood, not statehood. 2 years later, Hudson's acquired a quarter section of land through the Homestead Act south of the then village of Lancaster. He noted at that point in time in a diary that his only true neighbors were 2 dugouts on Oak Creek. He then had oak logs hauled in from Germantown, which is now Garland, Nebraska. There was a very large stand of oak trees there, which pretty much fueled a lot of the wood beginnings of the city of Lincoln and earlier Lancaster. But that was in 1863. He also brought milled floored lumber from Nebraska City and wooden shingles, which were literally unheard of in the village of Lancaster, from McKee's Island off of Peru, Nebraska. And that McKee's Island is a little area which still exists, cut off by the Missouri River. In a previous flood, it'd be interesting to see what's going on at McKee's Island today. Suspicion it could be underwater. The cabin, when completed, was noted as being the largest and grandest and the only shingled roofed building upon the whole site of Lancaster, Nebraska. At some early point, we can't tell exactly when, certainly no records exist of it, but it was moved to this site. We see it here at 2236 South 10th Street. And at that point in time, in 1964, they were going to tear the building down and build apartments or smaller houses in there. And Mayor Dean Peterson went in and bought the cabin for $5,000. It was numbered, the logs were numbered, and it was deconstructed, I guess would be the best way to put it. And then ultimately, the Junior Chamber of Commerce set out to raise funds to move it to a new site in Van Dorn Park. That didn't work. They weren't unable to get the funds, and ultimately the cabin was simply stored until 1974 when the Lincoln Parks Department transferred title to the Nebraska State Historical Society. They then moved the cabin, and it was reconstructed as part of the Heritage Village. Then, of course, with the universities acquiring the state fairgrounds, then it was moved to Piners Park, somewhere near, close to, we'll say, to the school building as well. Let's see. And there's what the cabin looked like in its reconstruction. And we're talking now about Mrs. William Jennings Bryan, not William. I think we've covered William some months ago. Her name was originally Mary Baird, B-A-I-R-D. She was born in Illinois in 1861. Her family was quite prosperous. They were merchants. She attended elementary school in Perry, Illinois, city of her birth, then went on to the Monticello, whatever it was, female seminary in Jacksonville, Illinois. And this was a point in time where a female seminary was not what we think of as a seminary today. It was not a religious training school. We think of a seminary as someplace you would go to maybe study to become a minister or something like that. A seminary then was just really more like a denominational high school. Would be probably an easier way to just think of it. Junior and senior high school in her case. She then graduated from what was a Presbyterian academy with honors in 1881. And while she was still in school in 1879, at sort of a meeting between schools, in the school's parlor, she met William, who at that time was a junior in college. She picked him out from others as being taller than the rest, and he was attracted to her. She was attracted to him at once. She said her first impression was that his thin, prominent nose was too large to look well. Very astute she was. However, he had a winning smile and dapper wardrobe. He wore, what this is, I don't know, but he wore a tiled white hat and carried a slender cane. Probably today this would get you into some sort of trouble here and there, or at least maybe an altercation, but apparently it was the style of the day. The courtship continued, and in Mary's words and William's words, it appears that it occurred mostly in parlors. This must have been where people met at that point in time. They were married, however, in October of 1884. In the meantime, Mr. Bryan had graduated from law school and was admitted to the Illinois bar and was working for a local attorney, but not with much of a practice. But they married, and then in 1885, their daughter, Ruth Baird Bryan, was born. Shortly after they were married, Mary began reading the law. This was not only an accepted way, it was almost more likely to be the way you would get your law degree. before being admitted to the state bar that you were interested in. In other words, you would study with an attorney. You would not go to law school. I don't know whether that ever happened with architects, but it did happen with doctors, and it happened with pharmacists, and strangely, it never happened with veterinarians. They had immediately to go to school. But basically, if you went to law school by studying at the foot of an attorney, as soon as you could pass the state bar exam, which made some degree of sense at that time, you became a licensed attorney or pharmacist or even physician, but never a veterinarian. They said that people valued their farm animals too much to allow that to go on, so, and possibly so. At any rate, Mary decided to read the law under William Jennings' direction. He had a course defined for her at the Union College of Law in Chicago. So she was going to study at the foot of an attorney. Her intention was not to enter the practice of law, but rather she wanted to be able to assist her husband in any cases that he might have. Mary's father said that, in fact, she didn't want Mr. Bryan to know more than she did. Could be. She was quite an intelligent lady, obviously. During their third year, when they were still living at College Hill as part of Jacksonville, Illinois, it was said that they made a decision specifically to not join a tennis club and not join a social club so that they could spend all their hours together studying. Probably also something which wouldn't happen today. But in October of 1887, William visited one of his law school friends, A.R. Talbot, who lived in the city of Lincoln. Came to Lincoln by himself and was very taken with the city of Lincoln. And leaving Mary in Illinois, he moved into the office that he and Mr. Talbot had in what was then known as the Burr Block, which is the building on the northeast corner of 12th and O Streets, which is now, I can never remember whether it's Cornerstone or Centerstone, but the building which we talked about in great length about having a couple of floors added on the top. Talbot and Bryan's law office was on the 5th floor. But if you would go today into the building to the 5th floor, you would not be on the floor that they had their law office because they've lowered all of the floors by 4 to 5 feet. So you can't go back to their office. Bryan slept on the couch in the office and cooked food over a gas ring. So he was not too well off at that point in time. But he did decide to move to the city of Lincoln. And he ordered a house built for himself at 1625 D Street. The house is still there and extant. And in the spring of 1888, Mary moved to Lincoln, and they moved into that house. Now, stepping aside from Mary for a second, the first woman who was admitted to the Nebraska State Bar was Ada Bittenbender, and she came on board in 1882. Then in 1885, a lady by the name of Fanny O'Lynn came on board, and she was a well-known attorney out in the Chadron, Crawford area, and even started a town out there, which still exists to this day. 1888, 2 more women were added to the bar. Mrs. A.J. Sawyer was one of them. Mrs. A.J. Sawyer was the wife of the mayor of the city of Lincoln, and A.J. Sawyer was the man who had that huge Carpenter Gothic house, which sat where today First Presbyterian Church is, and quite an elaborate home. At any rate, she and Mary Baird Bryan were both admitted either 3rd and 4th or 4th and 3rd. It depends on how you look at it. The 3rd and 4th female attorneys in the state of Nebraska. And Mary did serve as a law clerk during the earlier years, but she never did actually practice law in the broadest sense of the word. Curtis Toll and Payne, no relation to Miller and the South Haymarket area. And I've defined the South Haymarket. I don't think anybody's yet given it a new name, but it certainly will get one. As Lincoln's Haymarket expands ever towards the south, and we begin to look at buildings in there, such as we have built in the Haymarket area, the historic Haymarket, and buildings are acquired in that area, it becomes much more interesting to us. And what we now know as two buildings, Milltown and the Cotswold buildings, actually started even before the company started, even before the city of Lincoln existed. It started in Clinton, Ohio, when a man by the name of Charles F. Curtis, who had graduated from the Eastman Commercial College, purchased a small planing mill there. Later, it was joined by a man by the name of Curtis. It became Curtis and Brother, and this was interesting because the man's name, his last name, was Brother. And as you begin to try and write this down or talk to somebody else about it, Curtis Brothers and Company becomes almost impossible to explain. But it was two gentlemen, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Brother. They then, in 1869, established a branch in Wausau, Wisconsin, and then in 1886 they came to the city of Lincoln and built a building at 6th and M Streets. The company was then known as Curtis and Vandenberg. The name changes so many times in here in a short period of time that it's not really worth worrying about. Paul Bartlett joined the firm in the 1890s. He lived in a small house where today the University Towers parking garage, where I parked, was located. Then Charles Brother Toll, and there's that word brother again, Curtis's son-in-law, moves to Lincoln in 1900, and the firm becomes Curtis and Bartlett. There'll be a quiz on the name of the firm later on, and I'll be the first one to flunk it because I can never keep them straight. By that time, they had built actually two 3-story brick buildings in Lincoln, one at 300 South 6th, and then the original building, which was 601 M Street, very close to each other. They then had branches in Chicago and claimed to be the largest factory of their kind in the United States. So if you get to define it yourself, you can be the largest.
Was Toll Max Toll?
He was not Max, but Max, the county attorney, is related, that family, it's the same family, but it was not Max. Max comes into play a little bit later along with the great bank robbery in 1930, and an interesting guy in himself. And then his family lived on, and he had a nephew here called Niles Toll, who I knew later. He would be elderly today, close to 100, but the family stayed on quite a while. The Lincoln plant by that period in time covered pretty much a square block, and said they manufactured 1,500 glazed windows a day. Exactly what that means, hard to say, but they were serving Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Kansas. Many of Lincoln's homes were using these glazed windows. The Burr block, which we mentioned a moment ago, had windows glazed there. And they also said they had the largest stock of plain and fancy glass in the West. Again, who knows what that means, but when you write advertising, you can make it work. The plant, which sat primarily on Block 83, had one corner cut off by rail lines, all of them spurs. One of the spurs went completely into the building. One of them, the fifth spur, served a dock at 615 M Street. And at this point in time, the firm becomes Curtis, Toll, and Payne. That's 1906, and that's the name that any of us who think of the area down there usually associate with it. They also began manufacturing building paper at that time, and I think I would define building paper loosely as tar paper. I again to look to my architects to tell me if I'm way off base, but I must be close because nobody's standing up. They also continued making sash, doors, blinds, and molding products. By 1915, they had branches in Sioux City, Minneapolis, and Oklahoma City, growing very rapidly. During World War I, the corporation produced woodwork for many of the war housing projects across the United States, and that's when they built the Milltown, with an E on the end of it, building at 650 J Street. In 1923, a promotional book on the city of Lincoln said that from their original building, they hired 175 employees and also a staff of 5 salesmen in the field, that they had a neat sort of a display room, which featured glass-fronted display cases, tables, millwork, staircases they were manufacturing apparently intact, or at least in kit form. Not sure exactly how that worked. They also, in this building, had an employees' club room, library, lockers, and shower baths. And at that time, 1923, they claimed they were the oldest manufacturing firm in the city of Lincoln and also the largest. 1952, Charles died. His obituary was one of those which ran on and on and on. He had been on the board of directors of the First National Bank, president of the University Club, president of the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce, and on and on and on. The facility, however, closed completely as building trends changed in 1965, and W.F. Hoppe Company moved into one of the main buildings. 1966, the Curtis Company went out of business completely. All of its branches closed. Today, if we go over Rosa Parks Way, you will notice the Cotswold, they called it a ware room, where we call it a warehouse today. They called it a ware room. I'd never seen that used before and never since. Its top floors, one of those buildings lost in 1925, and then they were both remodeled in 1991. The two major buildings there. Pinewood Bowl. We've talked about Pioneers Park, so just to give you a gloss over, at Christmas of 1928, John Harris gave the city of Lincoln 500 acres of land for a park to be known as Harris Park, southwest of the city of Lincoln. It was to be named Harris Park for his parents, who were pioneers in the city of Lincoln and the state of Nebraska. He quickly added another 100 acres of land, and when he did at that time, he decided not to have the park named Harris Park in honor of his parents, but rather he said, let it be named Pioneers Park in honor of all pioneers. And that's why later on we honored him with an overpass. The Harris Overpass was one of the things to thank him for the park. Ernest Herminghaus, or Ernst, I believe, Herminghaus, was born in Lincoln in 1890, received his degree in horticulture at the University of Nebraska, his master's degree at Harvard, where he studied with Frederick Law Olmsted, famous park designer. Olmsted's concept worked with nature and very heavily influenced Herminghaus, who was considered as Nebraska's first academically trained landscape architect. Now I'll look at Eileen and make sure I'm still in the same ballpark. With Chet Ager, the park department head, Herminghaus formed a committee and accepted 3 designs for Pioneers Park in 1928, 1929. They rejected all 3 of the plans. Then Herminghaus deftly picked up pieces of each of the 3 plans. Exactly how legal that was, I'm not sure, but anyway, he picked up 3 parts from each of the plans and made them into a working plan for the original plan for Pioneers Park. Part of that plan included an amphitheater, which would have then been located southwest of the present Pinewood Bowl, and also near the smoke signal statue. And it also sat between 2 hills, but not exactly where it sits today. The area in 1935 saw 100 American Indians camping out for several days, about a week, and they were there for the dedication of Ellis Berman's statue of Red Cloud, the smoke signal. And there are a lot of photographs of those Indians camped there. 1937, the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, published a history of the city of Lincoln, a small little pamphlet. And in it they said about the park, the landscaping of this spacious park has attracted national attention. A natural amphitheater accommodating thousands makes it most unusual. Perhaps the most unusual part was there was no amphitheater there. They hadn't done anything to build it, so it was just an area in between the 2 hills. But they waxed eloquent about it anyway. Nothing much happened. The Great Depression interfered. 1939, the Women's Division of the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce formed. And in 1942, the Lincoln Air Force Base was activated. two events which were seemingly unconnected, however, meant that the large number of servicemen and their families in Lincoln attracted the attention of the Women's Division of the Chamber of Commerce and a group of a number of local ministers. These groups formed the Lincoln Civic Sing Fest Committee, which put together a non-denominational open-air service which was held 1942 on the grounds of the Capitol. And at the conclusion of the war, it was felt that they should develop this into something more permanent, and something with a purpose-built venue is what they had in mind. 1946, Herminghaus and Ager planned the north entrance to Pioneers Park on land which had been donated, and with the help of the Sing Fest Committee, solicited funds for the establishment of the amphitheater. July 13th, 1947, Pinewood Bowl was finally dedicated. And a week later, a sound system was added, and the park was dedicated to honor heroic men and women of World War II. The stage was simply 30 by 40 concrete platform built with a retaining wall, and this I didn't know until I looked a little closer, of sidewalk salvaged from the old Capitol building. Is any of that still out there? That I'm not sure. Don't know whether it's still there or not.
Sidewalks in the courtyard.
Okay.
Are salvaged stone.
So these, how did these become part of Pinewood Bowl? Now you're talking about in the courtyard, the black and white tiles?
Black and white were from the rotunda of the previous building, and the
Oh.
red flagstone was the public sidewalk around.
Okay, the flagstone, Bob tells me, was the sidewalk around the building. Okay. And it may still be there or may not, or some of it may still be. That I'm not sure of. The wings were 4 areas of hedges which had been planted on the sides, and then behind it there was another larger hedge. Screened completely then with evergreen trees and said to seat approximately 4,500 people, but it's one of those things there's no way to count because people just sat on the grass. Restrooms and dressing rooms were added in 1948, and benches which handled about 600 people were added in the front, just off the stage the following year. Very successful, and the bowl became also a very popular spot for flyovers from the Lincoln Airport. Hardly ever did you go to anything out there but everything didn't stop for a few seconds to let an airplane pass overhead. 1949, Nebraska Wesleyan's music professor, Oscar Pop Bennett, put on a production of Faust, which began a long-running series of events basically put on by Oscar Bennett, Mr. Music, as he was known at that time. Through the years, Pinewood Bowl has been used for practically everything, for graduation services, Easter sunrise services, graduation, and rock concert, practically anything you want. And was also, although this is an interesting statement, was the original grant given by the Lincoln Foundation for $539 for a movie and slide projector. But interestingly enough, I found 3 different projects which all claim to be the first grant. So which one for sure was? We'll say it was Pinewood Bowl today. Pinewood Bowl is still in a landing pattern of the Lincoln Air Force Base and the National Guard and the Municipal Airport. And interestingly, too, in 1986, part of the 1896 University of Nebraska's fence, which had been at a while at Auld Pavilion in Antelope Park, was moved out to the area around Pinewood Bowl, but I don't know where that is either, whether it's right at the front or not. Most of that fence, of course, is very visible as the O Street boundary of Wyuka Cemetery. The mosquitoes live on. Morris Wheel. Morris Wheel was actually born in France in 1875. At the age of 17, he became a clothier, moved to Kansas, and became associated with a man by the name of Julius Spear. In 1892, Weir moved with his family to the city of Lincoln. He was then, after he got here, looking for a second business opportunity for his son Julius. And at that point, he purchased the Thomas Wilkinson Paint Manufacturing Company in Burlington, Iowa, and moved it to the city of Lincoln. He set up a retail paint store at 1538 O and built a 4-story brick manufacturing plant at 825 M Street, which we know now today as Color Court. Within a few years, the plant was running 24 hours a day, had 60 employees, turning out, they said, 2,000 gallons of paint a day, which seems like a pretty good amount, and had sales in 8 states. Julius was supposed to be, this was his baby, but as near as we can tell, Julius never had anything to do with it. Morris was listed as a corporation officer and apparently operated the business. Then in 1895, Wheel's partner in Iowa, Julius Spear, moved to the city of Lincoln and opened a clothing store. And then, after that opened, Mr. Spear was joined by another Kansas merchant who came to the city of Lincoln, a man by the name of Ben Simon, who came in 1903. The firm then became Spear and Simon. Their primary building was at 10th and O Streets on the northeast corner of the building, which is now the site of a high-rise apartment, formerly a hotel. Spear and Simon ultimately will morph into Ben Simon and Sons. Now is virtually gone. 1902, Wheel built his mansion at 1149 South 17th Street, and his children lived there with him, grown children, I might add, and that house is still there. It's either a fraternity or a sorority, the last I knew, and I'm not sure which. Then, stepping aside again, Lincoln attorney Charles Dawes, who was later the Vice President of the United States, began buying land in the city of Lincoln when he lived here. He started in 1892 when he acquired the southeast corner of 13th and O, for which he paid $32,000. In 1893, he bought the northwest corner of 13th and O and paid $18,500 for it. I think it is a half-size lot, though. That's why he paid less money. But at that point in time, Wheel's other son, Carl, was working while attending law school. He was working for the American Savings Bank. So on Carl's graduation from law school, Morris began to look for a business which he could create for that son. Carl's interest in banking led Morris Wheel to purchase from Charles Dawes the southeast corner of 13th and O, which at that time was where the National Savings Bank had been located, and it had just gone bankrupt. There was a national depression in 1902, so it enabled him to buy that building and start a new bank in there, which he called the Bank of Commerce, 1902. He put himself in as president and Carl as assistant cashier, and a man by the name of Martin Aitken as the cashier. Wheel, however, had been already warned by his business associates that 13th and O was not a good place to establish any business. It was far too far east of the city of Lincoln to ever be a commercial success. And apparently he wasn't totally convinced of it himself, because his wife, who had been nagging him to get out of business, he said, "The second that bank is profitable, I will resign," and turn the bank over to Carl. The bank reached profitability in less than a year, and no mention is ever made of his turning it over to his son. He was probably as surprised as anyone else was. He also, by 1904, saw that there was a great advantage in taking the Bank of Commerce and turning it into the National Bank of Commerce, because one of the big things that he would be able to do as a national bank was that he could accept deposits from other state banks, which attracted him. And in 1904, the National Bank of Commerce was formed. Later, then, Dawes would buy the northwest corner of 13th and O Street from Dawes. That bank building, which was a tall, skinny building, served for a long time until it was renovated by a new architect in Lincoln, a man by the name of Martin Aitken's son. So keep it in the family. Then it was raised ultimately to build the current building there for the National Bank of Commerce, which is now Wells Fargo. Carl died in 1934, Morris died in 1945, Julius in 1965. The last son, Myron, came along in 1955, and today there is not a single wheel in the Lincoln phone book. The mansion on South 17th Street is now a bed and breakfast and was put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1994. Morris's obituary showed that he had been very active in the city of Lincoln. He was on the building committee for the South Street Temple, another building which is also on the National Register of Historic Places. The paint factory at 825 M Street was renovated in 1987 as an office building called the Color Court, and was again restored as a green project. Is it an LEED? I'm not sure. But it's at least a green project, and it's still very much in effect. This is the Bank of Commerce, which has moved into the defunct savings business. This is where Walgreens sits today. If you look carefully to the right of the picture, you'll see a 3-story building, just a little bit taller on the other side of the alley. That is the telephone building, the Bell Telephone Building, which still exists. Everything else, I think, is probably gone in this picture. This is the Wheel Mansion, which, as I mentioned, is now a bed and breakfast. Muni Fields and Muni Pool. Just before Luke Lavender, who was one of the 8 original members of the Methodist Protestant Female Seminary Association, came to Lincoln in 1867, he dug up a maple switch or twig, which had been located on land near what today would be the state penitentiary. Land given to the state of Nebraska, by the way, because they felt putting the penitentiary that far away would mean that if there was ever a prison break or a riot, it would be far enough away from the city there'd be no consequences. And of course, we built around it in the meantime. He then, Luke Lavender, planted that oak switch behind his cabin, and the oak switch supposedly stood about where Bennett Martin Public Library would be today. And because it was literally the original tree planted in the city of Lincoln or Lancaster, which during the surveys, the federal surveys noted there was not one single tree left within the confines of the city. There had been a giant elm down where the Lincoln depot stood later on, but of course it got cut down when the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad came in 1870. So literally this maple tree that he planted in 1867, the year of statehood, was the original tree to be planted in Lincoln and became known as the Grandpappy Tree. Within months, however, Luke Lavender moved, and he moved the tree. And I'll look again at Bob because I think we've talked about this, whether this is the most correct definition or not, I don't know. The southwest corner of 24th and L. And we're at least within a block of where that tree was. And every year the Lincoln Journal or the Star, sort of alternatingly, would go out and write an article about the Grandpappy Tree, take a picture of it. And I believe it was about 1957, 1958 when Warren Andrews was the assistant arborist for the city. Maybe a little later in the early 1960s, they went out to do their traditional picture of the tree and do their traditional story, and it was gone. Exactly why it was gone, the city park department never really came out and said. It may have died because maple trees don't live forever, certainly. It may have been to expand the ball diamonds, and my favorite story was that it was destined to become a parking lot for the ball diamonds. And if that part of the story is true, It really becomes a good story because they never built the parking lot because they did not have a curb cut. So the way I tell the story, just to keep your blood pressure up, is that we lost the original tree in the city of Lincoln to build a parking lot. And we didn't get the parking lot. But in all seriousness, I don't think a maple tree would have lasted much longer anyway. They're pretty short-lived. Now, by the 1880s, Lincoln's demand for water began to grow exponentially as the population grew, of course. And when we come to the original city of Lancaster and Lincoln, water is immediately of great concern because I'm sure you've heard me and others say that if you would drill a well in downtown Lincoln, you would most apt hit salt water, the remnants of the salt lake which existed literally over the basin, which was at one point in history the entire city of Lincoln, maybe as far east as 70th Street, for example, and as far north as Superior Street or Havelock Avenue. So a very large area. Well, as the water evaporated, as it has been doing at the Great Salt Lake for decades, this left the rock salt underground, which would then be dissolved by water, clear water, which became salt water. So drinking water, potable water, from the very earliest days was a very difficult thing for the city of Lincoln. There was a well-known 1-foot strata of water which existed from Denton to clear north of the city of Lincoln, which was glacial water. And so that's what we were tapping with a series of up to, at one point, 12 windmills to get that water. But by the 1880s, here's another something that was very close to you, Bob. At about the point, just a little southeast of where Antelope Creek crossed N Street. At that time, in 1880, the city sunk a well and built what was known as the Rice Pumping Station. And it was a major source of Lincoln's water until 1912. In 1911, 1912, there had been a typhoid epidemic breakout, and part of that was traced back to the Rice well. So it was closed and paved over. And here about 5 to 10 years ago, when they were repaving N Street in that area, they discovered that remnants of the well were still there, right off of Elliott School's property in probably what would be the playground today. And last I knew, the last time I was down there, you could still see this huge patch in the street, rectangular patch, where the edge of the Rice Street well sat. Whether it's been repaved or not, who knows? Probably needs to be. If it wasn't, I think it's a huge chuck hole today. Well, at any rate, we then, I think we talked last time about how the city purchased the land which would be the original nucleus of Antelope Park. They purchased it with the intent of mining it for water along the Antelope Valley right there. That centered at A Street, but by 1915, the Park Department said that they could foresee a time in the city of Lincoln that Antelope Park would reach as far as O Street. Then in May of 1915, a $50,000 bond issue, and coupled with a bunch of city gifts, the park did reach O Street, and that's where there's now, it was originally a drugstore, a grocery store, office supply store. I think it is a satellite of a clinic today. And this was grassed and seeded as part of Antelope Park. 1911, after major flooding occurred, the city and a sanitary district which had been created diverted Antelope Creek at that point in time and put a poured concrete conduit and took Antelope Creek underground at about M or N Street, and it comes out on Vine Street. And about World War I time, Muni Pool was constructed at about 23rd and M Streets. All this stuff just floats in an area where there are no streets. The 80 by 50 foot pool had at its depth 10 foot deep, but it ran down the middle instead of being on one end of the other as pools ordinarily would be. Diving boards were on the east and west ends of the pool. The shallow portions were therefore to the north and the south, and the north edge of the pool was a zero gravity pool so that you could walk into it. separated by ropes, of course. And in the northwest corner was a large three-tiered fountain. There are hundreds of pictures of this fountain, and I've seen numbers of them. They all have a big sign that says to no playing on it, keep off, and every single picture has that fountain covered with kids. So it was obviously a great attraction. In the height of the summer, my father told me that they would float cakes of ice in the pool to keep the water cold. And in the dead of winter, they would flood the shallow part of the pool and let it freeze in for ice skating. 1920s, the filter house was built directly to the east end of the pool. Then south of this building was a concession stand which served the ball diamonds. During World War II, the Air Force Base ball field, or the ball teams would come in and play Lincoln teams, and it was a great attraction during the city. By the 1950s, the complex, which we then called Muni Fields, contained 8 horseshoe courts, 2 croquet courts, the swimming pool, 5 softball diamonds, 6 tennis courts, 2 volleyball courts, and a playground, so a major park. The park also sponsored free swimming at the Muni Pool every Friday night for any student who had graduated from junior high school. 1947, the Circlet Theater, which had come from the Lindell Hotel and the Lincoln Community Theater, got together, and in 47, they produced their first play in the building. Muni Pool closed and was filled in as a parking lot. By 2005, even the little replacement Kukulin Pool had closed. Today, this building still exists, part of the Lincoln Park Department. It was one of the places that was considered as a possible home for the Telephone Museum, but it did not happen. It was too small a building. The little filter building, which was directly on the east end of the pool, is likewise gone, and we've got time for a couple of questions ere we ring down the curtain.
You said earlier that house that was built with shingles, that was like, what did they use for shingles prior to that?
Well, we didn't have shingles. In fact, most of the houses that were here would have had sod roofs. Comment, what we used before shingles was the question. Sod, pretty much. The first houses that I can think of, they would take telephone poles and then put sod over them. Another question? Yeah.
Was Charles Stewart a purchaser of NBC Bank instead of the founder?
You asked the question, was Charles Stewart a purchaser, but I think you mean James Stewart?
Well,
The Stewart family?
yeah, I thought it was Jim,
Well,
James, and then Charles.
well, James and Charles were brothers. Okay, then Jim, then Jimbo.
Yes.
And it's Chick, Charles, Chuck, too. We're gonna end it here, and we will pick it up again in a month or two. Thank you.
Thank you.